You're crouched in tall grass in the dark. Your boots are soaked. Somewhere ahead of you is the enemy, but that's not what you're worried about. What you're worried about is your next step, because in this war, the ground itself wants you dead. One wrong footfall onto a patch of leaves and a sharpened bamboo stake goes straight through your foot. That's Vietnam. But here's the thing, every war in human history had its own signature way of killing you, its own personality. And almost none of it looks like what you'd guess. So let's do something grim and fascinating. Let's walk through the major wars of human history, one by one, and answer a very simple question. If you were there, how would you actually die? Let's start at the beginning. Because for most of human history, the thing that killed you in a battle wasn't a sword. It was a bad night's sleep next to sick men. Go back to the ancient world and picture the classic image. 2 armies, bronze, spears, shields. A lot of yelling. And yes, plenty of men died on the point of a spear. But even then, the real killer was already in camp. Cram thousands of men into a muddy field with no plumbing and one shared water source, and disease does more work than any general. The Greek historian Thucydides watched it happen firsthand. In 430 BC, during the war between Athens and Sparta, a plague tore through the packed city of Athens. It killed an estimated 30,000 people, roughly a quarter of the population, more than any Spartan army ever managed. Thucydides caught it himself and survived, which is the only reason we have the description. So the pattern is set on day 1 of recorded warfare. The battle is loud. The thing that kills you is quiet. Hold that thought, because it comes back again and again. Now jump forward to the medieval battlefield, and the arrival of a weapon so effective the French spent decades pretending it wasn't. The longbow. October 25th, 1415. A muddy field in northern France near a village called Agincourt. King Henry V of England has maybe 6,000 men, most of them exhausted, hungry, and dealing with dysentery, which we'll get to. Facing them, a French army several times larger, packed with armored knights, the tanks of their day. The English had roughly 5,000 longbowmen. A trained archer could put 10 to 12 arrows in the air every minute. Do the math. That's tens of thousands of arrows a minute falling out of the sky, not aimed at any one man. Just a rain of iron coming down on a crowd. But here's the part people get wrong. The arrows mostly didn't punch through the best plate armor. What they did was worse. They forced the French knights to lower their heads and bunch together, and they turned the field into a killing funnel. The knights sank into knee-deep mud. Men fell. Men behind them tripped over the fallen. And thousands of armored Frenchmen suffocated and drowned in the muck under the weight of their own comrades. Estimates put French dead somewhere around 6,000. The English lost a few hundred. Think about that. The deadliest weapon at Agincourt wasn't really the arrow. It was mud, panic, and gravity. The bow just started the pileup. So we've got spears, plague, and arrows. And then someone figured out how to put an explosion in a tube, and everything changed. Or at least, you'd think it did. Here's the twist about the age of muskets and cannons. For about 300 years, the gun was often the least of your problems. Let me give you the single best example in history. Napoleon, 1812. He assembles the largest army Europe had ever seen to invade Russia. The numbers vary by source, but he crosses into Russia with somewhere around 600,000 men. 600,000. Now, how many of them do you think died in these big, famous, dramatic battles? Fewer than you'd ever guess. Because the Russians did something clever. They refused to fight him properly. They retreated, they burned their own crops and villages, and they let 2 other generals do the work. Their names were Winter and Lice. The soldiers were filthy. They slept packed together for warmth, which is exactly what body lice want. And those lice carried disease, fever, rash, and then a lot of men simply died. Modern DNA testing on the soldiers' remains has actually complicated the old "it was all typhus" story and turned up other louse-borne infections like relapsing fever and paratyphoid. But the headline doesn't change. Of the roughly 600,000 who marched in, only a few tens of thousands staggered back out. The rest were killed mostly by cold, starvation, and microscopic things living in their clothes. Napoleon wasn't beaten by an army. He was beaten by hygiene. And if you think that's a one-off, it isn't. Because the exact same thing was about to happen on American soil, with better record keeping to prove it. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Around 620,000 soldiers died, though newer estimates push that number higher, maybe as high as 750,000. And here's the statistic that should be on every history poster. About 2/3 of them didn't die in battle. They died of disease. The number one killer wasn't a bullet, it was diarrhea, dysentery. The Union Army alone logged over 1.5 million cases of it. Men dug their latrines uphill from their drinking water. Nobody understood germs. And the result was entire regiments hollowed out by illness before they ever saw combat. One Louisiana regiment lost 233 men in battle and 349 to disease. More men died running to a latrine than charging a hill. Now I've been hammering one grim point for a few minutes now. Battle is loud, disease is quiet, the quiet thing wins. Cheerful stuff. Take a breath, stretch, refill your coffee. Because now the pattern breaks. Now we hit the wars where the weapons finally, catastrophically, caught up. And this is where it gets genuinely dark. The First World War. This is the moment humanity industrialized killing. And the machine that did most of it wasn't the machine gun, as famous as that is. It was artillery. Big guns firing exploding shells packed with steel. By most estimates, artillery caused around 60% of all casualties in the war. And some armies put the wound rate even higher. And it introduced a new, horrible way to die. Not a clean shot. You'd be sitting in a trench and a shell would land, and you would simply cease to exist, or be buried alive, or torn apart by flying metal you never saw coming. Men developed what they called shell shock, just from the endless, inescapable noise of it. And then, on July 1st, 1916, the machine gun got its infamous day. The first day of the Battle of the Somme. British commanders sent waves of men walking, across open ground toward German trenches, believing a week of shelling had cleared the way. It hadn't. The German machine gunners climbed out of their deep bunkers and opened up. By the end of that single day, the British suffered 57,470 casualties. Over 19,000 of them dead in one day. It is still the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. So in the span of one war, we went from disease being the main killer to a machine that could erase a generation of young men in an afternoon. And unbelievably, we found a way to make it bigger. The Second World War. Now, the killing doesn't even need you to be a soldier. Everything from the First World War came back, scaled up. Bigger guns, faster tanks, bombs falling from planes onto cities full of civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo in a single night in 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people, most of them civilians, burned in a man-made firestorm. And then, on August 6, 1945, over Hiroshima, humanity unlocked the final door. A single bomb, one plane, one weapon, and roughly 70,000 to 80,000 people dead in an instant, with tens of thousands more to follow from burns and radiation. For the first time ever, you could die in a war and never know a war had reached you. No spear, no arrow, no warning, just a flash. We had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of killing one man at a time. And then we built something that killed a city in a heartbeat. Which finally brings us back to where we started. To the grass and the bamboo stake and your very careful next step, Vietnam. Because after the nuke, you might assume war just became a question of who has the bigger machine. Vietnam is the war that proved the opposite, that a barefoot farmer with a knife and some bamboo could bleed the most powerful military on earth. The Viet Cong couldn't win a straight fight, so they didn't have one. They turned the jungle itself into the weapon. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo in a hidden pit, often smeared with filth so the wound would rot. Tripwired grenades hidden in cans. Whip traps. A crossbow rigged to a tripwire that fired silently across a trail. And here's the genius, if you can call it that. Most of these weren't designed to kill you. They were designed to wound you, because a dead soldier is one man down. A screaming, injured soldier ties up 2 more men to carry him, a helicopter to evacuate him, and puts fear into everyone who watched it happen. Historians estimate mines and booby traps caused somewhere around 11% of American deaths and around 15% of the wounds, though the figures are debated and ran much higher in certain regions. The famous punji steaks themselves were a small slice of that, more feared than they were lethal. But the number was never really the point. The point was that every single step, all day, every day, might be your last. The whole country became the trap. So there's your tour. Spears and plague in the ancient world, arrows and mud in the medieval one. Then centuries where lice and dirty water quietly outkilled every general who ever lived. Then the machines arrived, and artillery and firestorms, and a single bomb rewrote what a bad day could mean. And then a man with a sharpened stick reminded everyone that the oldest tricks still work. But notice the thread running through all of it. For most of human history, the thing most likely to kill you in a war was never the enemy's weapon. It was the water you drank, the lice in your coat, the wound that got infected. War's greatest killer was almost always something you couldn't see, which is worth remembering the next time you complain about a flu shot or a doctor nagging you to wash your hands. For most of the people who ever marched off to fight, that boring, invisible stuff was the actual war. The battle was just the part that made the paintings.